when I describe you to other people, my mate David from university is basically a compulsory purchase and viability expert.
True.
That'd be right, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Let's just jump back. So remember when we were, I don't want to put a whole load of boring history about when we were at university, right? But when we were, if you don't mind me saying, David, I think I was probably the roughest sounding bloke and you're the poshest sounding bloke. So unlikely mates, probably.
No, I don't think so, but yes.
Okay. Well, anyway, but I was always into planning. That's why I went and did what I did, right?
Yeah.
So I was always into land and planning and development, as you know. Obviously, it's interesting. I think we were the only ones that did sort of go into planning and development stuff. But I don't remember. Did you want to do that at the time? I can't remember.
I wanted to be in property development. That was the area that I wanted to get into. Interesting. And so to me, it was the key components as to how you make development work, which led me in due course to effectively doing viability. But viability is an end product in the sense that you've got to know all of the component bits that go into it in order to be able to give advice in that area. So I've done a lot of planning applications. I've probably done about 1,200 planning applications, but I don't see myself as a planner. I understand planning because it's the basis of compulsory purchase. So you have to understand how the policy forms, how the application functions in terms of delivering the public benefits. So I have a very wide knowledge. I'm an old-fashioned, in one sense, general practice surveyor, but it's not. But it's all about how to deliver profitability from all of those aspects. That's what really attracts me to it. Viability and CPO are two elements of what I do, but they're not the only things that I do. It's also about structuring landowner agreements, development agreements, unpicking problems in the development process. And some of those are unusual. So it may be putting landowners together to create a land agreement structure. It may be commenting on the commerciality of Section 106 clauses, for example. It's a mixture of different things. But the two areas I give expert witness on happen to be viability and compulsory purchase.
Viability is a massive, massive, massive subject and becoming increasingly important as things become more and more unviable, right? So that's a big subject, really important subject. But before we get on to that, let's just talk a bit about the compulsory purchase thing, because that is very specialist and not a lot of people know much about it.
In very simple terms, pretty much every single government entity has got compulsory purchase powers. The most frequently used powers that people will come across and come up against will be National Highways Authority using them to build roads. But they're also used for building any major infrastructure projects. So we've got specific processes which help deliver nationally important infrastructure. But the other aspect the other area that's predominantly used is the council's 226 powers, which are the powers for regeneration, effectively, for doing major city centre or urban schemes and delivering those along with usually development partners. And over the years have acted for the development partners, the local authorities or the planning authorities, bringing forward the powers, as well as major claimants, so some of the major, people like Tesco or H&M and others, people like that, and using who are trying to defend themselves against the use of those powers. But the powers are there to enable land assembly to deliver a public benefit, and the public benefit is wider than just the benefits that you see from the planning process. They're a little bit more broadly drawn than that. And there's a hugely, some would say, burdensome process, but rightly so. It has to be burdensome. I mean, they're the most draconian powers that the public sector can use against the private population, taking their land, taking their property for a defined public benefit. We look to make sure that the construct of the CPO is right, that the benefit is properly articulated, whether we're challenging or defending against one. And then we look to make sure that the procedures that are being used have been properly applied. CPO has an interesting history, going back to the 70s when it was used for slum clearance. It was used in quite a draconian and quite a hard way. And there was a philosophy behind it, which was the transference of large privately owned estates into effectively what then became public ownership in terms of council housing and large council estates. More recently, those powers are being used much more surgically, and they've got to be justified. They've got a proof process that needs to be gone through, but they are a really useful tool to accelerate urban regeneration when they're used properly. That doesn't stop them being used as a very large mallet to crack a small nut, but that's not what their primary purpose is in one sense. They're there to deliver that public benefit, and we're going to see more of them being used as the importance of delivering the government's objectives of 1.5 million homes, accelerates. They're going to need to use CPO powers to deliver it, and there's a lot of process that's being talked about at the moment in terms of how those are going to be applied to large urban scale extensions, for example, and the pricing of land that goes with that. Government has been caught out a few times by the cost of buying land using CPO powers, so there is motivation, shall we say, to try and curtail the amount of money that is being paid to landowners.
Let's just say it's complicated, isn't it?
It is complicated.
So I've been involved in a few years ago when I was working for big developers and doing very big deals.
Yeah.
And from my experience, if you've got a big estate regeneration scheme and, whatever, then that might be a different thing. When the local authority really, really want it to happen, I've found it really hard to actually get local authorities to compulsory purchase stuff or back you up in doing it. It seems to me, historically at least, I don't know what things are like now, I might be wrong, it feels like it's a bit of an absolute last resort thing.
Well, I think there's a number of things that have changed. Going back some time when the urban development corporations were doing an awful lot of using the compulsory purchase powers for the bigger regeneration schemes, whether it was Docklands or, in middle of Bristol, middle of Birmingham, wherever it was, they cut out the local authorities in using those powers. And so local authorities didn't have that skill set. They'd used them in the 60s and 70s when they were doing slum clearances. Then they didn't use them for 20, 30 years. Then the urban development corporations came in the sort of 80s and started using them again. Now that those urban development corporations have fallen away, local authorities are beginning to step back up into the mark of doing more CPOs. So there's a learning curve, there's a use curve in relation to how comfortable they feel using them. You talk to the larger, metropolitan authorities, London or Manchester or wherever, they're used to using those powers. They've got the skill sets in-house now. Some of the smaller authorities don't have those skill sets, and it's still a big ask for them to go down that route. So it is changing. The procedures have got clear. Successive governments have sort of shied away from rewriting CPO law, which is still complicated, spread over a number of acts, and hugely informed by case law, which is, in short, is called the Compulsory Purchase, the CPO Code. So it's not as easy to navigate as some other laws or some other systems and processes. But local authorities are beginning to get there, and they'll need to if they're going to deliver the sort of housing numbers that are being envisaged.
Let's make up a little case study as an example for people so we can all understand how it works, yeah? So let's say I've got a fairly big site that I've either bought or secured on an option or subject to planning agreement or whatever it might be, and there's someone in the middle that's a pain in the arse that refuses to leave, or more likely they want 10 million quid or 100 million quid or insert crazy number here, which means the whole thing's never going to work, right? And it's 50% affordable housing, going to build a nice new community centre on the ground floor as well. So, it's a public benefit. Yeah. So I want and hope that I can get the local authority to basically help me out with the bloke in the middle. How would that work?
You've got to make sure that the public benefit is more defined than just simply in a planning application in that sense. So it's got to have a policy basis sitting behind it. It's got to have gone through a process where the public benefit of the proposition at a headline level has been articulated and tested.
So just on that, so this is important detail, right? So if it was 50% affordable housing and a new community centre, would that not be enough?
It may be. It really depends on what the policy basis is for that proposal. So if, for example, it has no policy articulation at the time it's brought forward, then you'll have to make the public benefit case in the sense that it's made as part of the creation of policy. Is there a need demonstrable in a public sense for the delivery of this proposal? Having articulated that public benefit and the local authority agrees and supports the proposition of that public benefit being delivered, and there are no likely to be planning hindrances in terms of its delivery, then that's when the use of CPO powers can be explored. But, there's a few steps to go through in the process before you can just simply say, well, I've got a piece of land, I'm going to deliver a benefit. It's got a prima facie case, you must use your powers. That's not quite how it works. The council have to make sure that they can articulate and support the public benefit that's being created from the proposed scheme. But it's been used for delivering houses, it's been used for delivering new towns, it's been used for delivering public works such as, schools or hospitals or anything else. It's been used for a huge variety of purposes. So there is no limit in a sense to the scope that it can be used for. The powers are very widely drawn. They're akin to the well-being powers, which is, are they social, economically and environmentally beneficial? Or environmentally beneficial. So the powers can be used for any purpose in that sense.
Yeah. The reason I'm trying to understand a bit more is because there might be people listening that, they're not Barretts and they're not British Land. They might have a smaller scheme or something where dislodging someone that's stopping it all happening would unlock a scheme.
Yep.
But they're wondering, I wonder if this is the sort of thing where CPO could be used.
The balance that you're working on is it appropriate to expropriate, to take private rights for a public benefit? It's a balance point. If the public benefit outweighs the importance of protecting the private rights, then essentially you've got a prima facie case in that sense. But you have to be able to articulate the public benefit sufficiently clearly and well enough and have appropriate support for it in order to overcome those private rights.
What sort of support? So obviously policy, you mentioned.
Policy, and it's got to go through, most local authorities will take the use of compulsory purchase back to the cabinet level or full council. It won't be simply a planning authority matter. So the recognition in the system is the draconian nature of these powers, because they are very, apart from conscripting us and sending us off to war, they're one of the most draconian sets of powers that a public authority can use on its people, taking away their rights over land and property. But if there is a public benefit doing it, that's what they're there for. Obviously, there are going to be particular circumstances where those are used extensively. There was a huge amount of compulsory purchase, obviously, during the war to create new airfields and air bases and an awful lot besides. There was obviously the use of compulsory purchase powers, but under specific acts, to deliver the railway networks and the road networks and new towns. So they've been used for majorly important things. And they're being used today for similar projects, whether it's the creation of the utilities networks, serving the new nuclear power stations, or the new Lower Thames crossing, or similar major infrastructure projects. When you're into town centres, and when you're into a much finer grain of ownerships, where you've got a lot of people being affected, you've got landowners, you've got potential occupiers and businesses and people's homes, they need to be used carefully.
That's going to be a good example. But firstly, let me summarise it. Tell me if I'm not summarising this correctly. For perhaps smaller developers and someone that's just got a difficult landowner somewhere involved, right? It is very complicated. It's not easy to get local authorities to do it. Unless it's pretty big and there's a pretty big benefit, they're probably not going to do it.
That's probably true.
Okay.
Not exclusively, but it's probably
Yeah.
true.
Yeah. So
I mean, the compulsory purchase, just to be clear, the compulsory purchase powers go down to the purchasing of listed buildings that, for example, aren't being looked after properly. So they can be used that surgically, because the public benefit of maintaining a heritage asset might be greater than the rights of the owner of that building who isn't maintaining it properly.
Yeah.
So they can be used very, very surgically like that.
Like you mentioned town centres as an example.
Yeah.
Now, I know that town centre regeneration is one of your big things, and it's obviously massively needed. Town centres all over the country are in a real mess. A lot of them for reasons most people know about. But of course, they're very well located. Obviously, they're in the town centre. So for starters, so they are, lots of them, potentially brilliant places for, mixed uses, lots of new accommodation and the rest of it. But a big problem, of course, is very often they are in lots of separate ownerships.
Yeah.
So how would we deal with that?
We're still talking about use of CPO in that situation, for example.
What I would do is, if I've spotted a town centre that I think is ripe for regeneration, obviously I'll go away and do land registry searches, find out who owns all the various bits. Obviously I'll get a scheme done to see roughly what the sort of values are, what I can get out of it. Now obviously I know how much I've got to play with in terms of negotiating with all the different landowners. And then I would approach and start negotiating with all the different landowners. And hopefully, in an ideal world, they would all say, yeah, lovely, and agree. But that tends not to happen. You end up with at least one difficult person, and very often lots and lots. But if you can get people negotiated and agreed, fantastic. That is the way to do it.
Yeah.
Now, assuming that I do all of that, but then there's a couple in there that I can't get agreed, and I then wanted to go to the local authority and say, look, I've got this fantastic scheme. It would be bringing new life to the currently dying town centre and jobs and all of the good stuff that comes with that. What would happen then?
Well, I mean, you'd still go. You would effectively do the same process, which I've been talking about, which is you have to effectively get the agreement of the local authority that what you're proposing is delivering the public benefits that they seek or that are being sought. And in that context, you would want to be covered to make sure that there's a policy process that's gone through a consultation process that's been supported by the council in terms of articulating what the public benefit of the proposed project or the proposed regeneration is. And that way, you using their powers becomes part of that process of delivering that public benefit. But local authorities are bereft of cash at the moment. They've got little flexibility. They would need to be convinced that the project is actually going to be delivered, because using those powers and then not having it delivered effectively doesn't support the use of CPO and will make it more difficult for others coming forward with ideas. So there's a whole number of steps that need to be gone through to get the powers to be actually exercised, apart from putting aside the policy position and getting the public benefit articulated. And local authorities would need to be secure in their relationship with the partnering developer that they're using their powers to deliver. The developer would need to be fully on board with delivering the public benefits that the scheme is due to deliver. So whether that be affordable housing or whether that be community uses or whatever the purpose of the scheme's public benefits are, they'd need to be able to articulate and support the delivery of those. And that can be challenging.
And expensive. Which, again, is, one of the reasons. Because I would imagine there might be people out there thinking, this town centre is not very good. Why doesn't someone sort it out? Well,
yeah, I mean, one thing that CPO does give you is, whilst it is a complicated process, it does give you a degree of certainty that straightforward negotiation doesn't necessarily. It doesn't stop you having to do the negotiation process. One of the things you need to be able to demonstrate in the use of powers effectively is that you have sought to secure by private treaty the land and the interests that you need to deliver it. So you've got to go through that process anyway. If you've got it structuredly or effectively, then you can be much more straightforward with people, and you can save time and money as a consequence. But you need to have everything lined up. You need to make sure you're doing it. You're structuring the business efficiently. It wouldn't be particularly efficient to do an awful lot of private sector work first, and then eventually at the end of that, when it's all failed and gone wrong, or you haven't secured that last 2 or 3 interests, then to turn to the local authority and say, well, can you now use your CPO powers? Because effectively you haven't necessarily got the proposition lined up in the right place to start using the CPO powers. So it's worthwhile, if you're doing a larger project, to go and have those early conversations with the local authority and work in a truly collaborative and partnership way.
So basically you'd go to the local authority and just say, look, well, this is what I think you would do. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, because we're trying to educate people, including myself, right? I'd spot a few the major landowners in there, go and approach them, test them, see if that they were on board. Then I'd sort of get a in principle agreement, that we might get involved for the right thing. Then, of course, you could go and perhaps talk to the local authority, get them to agree to some sort of regeneration plan or whatever. So you then have got a policy to back it up.
Yeah.
Then you can perhaps start moving things on with the rest of the landowners. So it's all a bit chicken and egg, isn't it, really?
Yeah. I mean, you've got to move forward on on a number of fronts if you're going to look to use, or you think you've got a scheme which is capable of delivering the public benefits that are being sought by policy or similar.
Yeah.
You need to be prepared to go and have those conversations. And for major schemes in the UK, that can be a slow process. If you're looking to embed the thinking in the formation of a local plan, and the average local plan is taking 3 to 5 years as a minimum to deliver, then these larger schemes can take some time. You might be able to get it supported by supplementary planning documents, but again, it's got to go through an appropriate consultation process to demonstrate that it's got the policy underwrite. It's not strictly necessary, but it's sensible to have policy which supports the proposals that you're looking to deliver.
So let's say we've done that, got a few of the key landowners agreed in principle. We've got the local authority liking it. They do a bit of a consultation and, want to back it. They want to see it happen as well. So it's then, we're then firming things up in terms of schemes and designs and negotiations, hopefully narrowing it down. So there's only a couple of little land ownerships that we haven't got agreed, yeah? So we now want to try to now we've got to move forward towards the actual proper compulsory purchase process. How much is it going to cost, and who pays?
Pretty much always, where it's a development partnership, it'll be the developer paying, or the acquiring authority who's promoting the scheme. So, Lower Thames Crossing, it's the Lower Thames Crossing entity that's effectively going to be paying for it all. They've got what's known as a DCO, which is a slightly different process, which
we don't do the big complicated stuff. I'm not going to be doing any Lower Thames crossings anytime soon.
So certain entities are structured to have their own powers and have their own funding structures. So in that's about them standing up and saying, we've got the money to drive this scheme forward, and the ability to deliver it. Where it's a partnership between the local authority and the developer, the local authority will need to demonstrate that they're holding the developer to account in terms of delivery, that they know that the developer's got the funding and the capacity to deliver the scheme and to pay for the land that they're compulsorily acquiring. So there'll be various agreements. There'll probably be a primary development agreement. There'll probably be a compulsory purchase indemnity agreement, which is indemnifying the council's costs for the CPO power use and formation, and that will all be tied up legally.
So the point, I'm just really trying to get the message out there that it's, as always, largely to be the developers it's on the line, and a lot of money, and they pretty much got to guarantee it, because local authorities, they're sort of putting their it's on the line to some extent, and of course they haven't got the funds to do all of this stuff, so they need to know that they are effectively backing someone that is going to be able, to make this happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why the development partners who tend to work with local authorities tend to be the more established businesses and entities who have got that firepower or have got the balance sheet capacity to demonstrate that they've got the resources to deliver the scheme. Now, that still doesn't necessarily happen. the Whitgift scheme in Croydon, which went through planning a number of times and eventually, and where powers were sort of partially exercised, the relationship that was behind it hasn't stood the test of time. And, that was down to COVID and a whole bunch of other reasons. But it doesn't always go that the biggest entities have got actually deliver when they've got the compulsory powers to use to deliver the scheme.
Yeah, well, look, the interesting thing is it doesn't matter how big you are in development. Things change, and they can catch everyone out, no matter how big a business you are. So that's really important things for everyone to understand. Development, however big you are, really isn't easy at all.
Yeah.
Let's just talk about valuation. So in these situations, let's just say I'm going to regenerate the town centre and I'm going to build 1,000 homes and a load of new shops and community stuff, and it's going to be lovely. I've got a couple of landowners in there that won't go. Everyone else is agreed. The local authority's backing it. How do those bits get valued?
Well, their market value is the short answer.
As they are existing use, ignoring planning.
No. The market value of the properties, which includes effectively their development potential, if that can be demonstrated, and there's a whole process.
Would that not be the development potential, ignoring your scheme?
Ignoring the scheme is the development potential of the individual sites within their own boundaries. There is a huge level of complexity, so you don't benefit. You don't get an added value benefit from the scheme that's being promoted by the acquiring authority. But that doesn't mean to say that if you've got a piece of land which has, in of its own right, development potential for a standalone scheme out with the rest of the proposed development, that it doesn't have development value as part of its market value. So in simple terms, you've got a car park in the middle of a busy centre which could deliver in its own right a chunk of development, but becomes part of a larger CPO. The value of that car park has two values, essentially. One is its car park use, in its, as you say, its existing use, but it also has in its own right its own market value as a development site, assuming no scheme would come forward. But there is a process to go through. And there's a huge amount of complexity in terms of all of the rules around the compensation code and the way in which payment happens. But in simple terms, it's that market value principle. Now, one of the proposals in relation to certain types of development that are being brought forward, for example, social housing sites, there is a thought process or consideration being promoted by government at the moment in relation to effectively capping the potential alternative use value for those types of sites. A lot of contention going on at the moment in relation to it. So there are rules potentially coming down the road which might impact on or cap values for certain types of land which are going to be put to certain types of use.
Let's jump onto that then. So suffice to say, it's complicated and expensive.
It is.
Which is why is that why you live in the castle now, knowing how to deal with these things?
I wish I didn't live in a castle. No, I don't live in a castle.
We know it's complicated, right? Smaller developers, unless they've got massive backing or partnering with someone or whatever, they are very unlikely really to sort of make a CPO happen, I would say, right?
Yeah.
But now someone might find themselves, might not be a small developer, it might be another landowner or whatever, that are in a situation whereby they've got some land and someone, the local authority or whoever, is proposing to CPO it. Yeah.
Yep.
And of course, if that is going to happen, they want to make sure they get the best price for it, and it's taken away from them for what it's really worth. How would they deal with that?
I mean, they'll obviously be approached by the developer to try and buy the land, and they need to consider whether or not they should invest in their proposition in their land before things go further. So, if it has got planning potential, whether they start off a planning process and look to achieve a planning value out of it themselves before it's acquired.
So let me stop you there. So if a site had an extant planning permission,
Yeah.
then that would be very good evidence of the planning potential.
Sure.
But of course, if it didn't, it's a different situation. So how does that sort of planning potential or not get assessed if you haven't got a full planning permission?
Well, there's a process called a Certificate of Appropriate Alternative Development, where you would demonstrate the ability of that site to deliver a scheme, and therefore the value of that land, not the development value. It's the land value that underwrites that development or comes as a consequence of that development value. If that's more than the existing use, then it's worth going through that CAD process to deliver it, sometimes called a Section 17 certificate.
Okay.
So there are mechanisms to demonstrate planning value from sites, but the value isn't in the profits that one might have made from the development. It's in the land value, the residual land value that comes out as a consequence of that proposed development.
Yeah.
Which may or may not be more than the existing use value.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got a car park in the middle of London, that's quite a high existing use value. It might not be any more than or any less than. It might be no more, or it might be more than the
Development value. Okay.
In of its own right.
So what would be the process be then? So you don't have to submit.
It's a very similar thing to going through a planning application process. You've got to demonstrate the deliverability of a scheme. Now that's up for a debate, that's up for a discussion, but you've got to go through plans, you've got to show the constraints of the site, you've got to demonstrate its deliverability, and you've got to demonstrate there's a market for that use. I mean, there's no point in producing something which has no real development value at the end of it, because it wouldn't underwrite an effective land value. There are a lot of things to consider as to whether you go for that through that process, but it can be expensive. In the same way that a planning application can be expensive.
Yeah.
You can appeal that process through what's known as the Upper Tribunal Lands Division, sometimes called the Lands Tribunal, as part of that process if you don't get an effective response from the local planning authority. In
order for let's say I own a bit of land, it's getting compulsory purchased or proposed to be, I know what it's worth. So this is good, because I want to get onto viability in a minute as well, right?
Yeah.
So let's just say, you keep.
Well, I was going to say the CAD process is effectively only triggered once the CPO process is initiated. So it doesn't happen before the CPO process, which is why the other consideration is to whether you go through planning prior to the CPO process being put in place. So that's the discussion point, or the decision point you have to make.
I think it needs to know, well, actually, is it even worth me doing this, or is the existing use value going to be higher than the development value?
It's a really difficult decision that has to be made by a landowner, because the moment you stop trying to use your land, the moment you stop investing in your land, you effectively start degrading its value. So when a compulsory purchase does come and you've not done anything or used your land effectively in the interim, you've really diminished its value. So your CPO value becomes lower. So one of the pieces of advice I'll give people usually is, if there isn't a commercial deal which suits you at this point prior to the CPO being, utilised or being executed, you want to consider whether, what your business plan is in relation to the use of your land. If you're running an office, or you're running a factory, or you're running a commercial building, don't stop investing in it or don't stop maintaining it because there's the potential of a CPO that might happen at some point in the future. Because if you've got an office in disrepair, it's going to be a lot worse, a lot less than an office in good repair.
Okay, well, maybe that's not common sense. Do you actually get people doing that? They think they might be CPOs, so they just sort of like leave it and throw the towel in effectively and just wait to see what happens?
Well, they're worried about not getting their money back from the investment that they're continuing to make. And it's a difficult set of business decisions. If you're a business which has got major plant and machinery and you're making a decision as to whether or not you're going to be, investing in a new piece of plant and machinery, that's a significant piece of capital expenditure, and you've got a threat of CPO, well, that becomes a really difficult decision.
Yeah, I see that. It's tricky, isn't it? Let's make it simple, because let's get onto the sort of viability stuff now.
Yeah.
So let's say it's got an existing use value of, so it's an office, it's tenanted, you know what the rent is, you know what the yield is. You can value it up. It's got an existing use value of £2 million, just making numbers up, right?
Yep.
And then separately, you go away and do a quick development appraisal, obviously making a load of assumptions about what you might be able to do on there. And the result of that is the residual land value is less than £2 million. Well, you just the existing use value is higher. You just leave it as it is.
In CPO terms, you would claim the existing use value in that sense, and if that's the highest market value for the site, then that's ultimately that's what it comes down to. If the residual land value is less from a development proposal on the site than the existing use value, then the market value would be the higher of the two.
So this leads us, I hope, nicely into just general development viability.
Yeah.
And what's driving it all anyway, which is really existing use values. If you've got that same site or office building or whatever it is that's worth £2 million, and I or you or someone else thinks it might have development potential, in order for it to make any sense for the landowner to sell, I've got to come up with something that's better than the existing use value. Otherwise, why would they do anything other than just leave it as it is?
Yeah, so if we're talking about a planning viability here at the moment.
Yeah, that's what we're getting onto now.
Then we've got...
Well, we're actually getting onto development viability, actually.
Well, development
in terms
viability
of whether you can actually turn a bit of land into a deal that makes it worth everyone's while.
If your residual value from your development proposal is less than £2 million, and you've got to pay more than £2 million to get the site, then in straightforward commercial terms, that site isn't going to stack for you. You need to move on and buy something else. Because unless you can increase the gross development value to enable you to pay more for the land, you're not going to make any money.
Right, just a quick one. Whether you are a massively experienced and well-established property developer already, or maybe you're a new or aspiring one, either way, you will know that it is really not easy to find viable opportunities to come up with the best scheme, the best design that's going to maximise the land value and fully de-risk things for you, and then to go on to get the very best planning permissions as quickly as possible. However experienced you are, you will know that that is not an easy thing. I have put together a super detailed scorecard based on my 40 years experience in this industry, reverse engineering everything that I've learned, including lots and lots of mistakes over the years, and everything I've done to maintain, touch wood, 100% planning track record. I'm pretty sure there will be stuff that you don't know. Go and do that scorecard. Find out just how good or not your current process is, and I absolutely guarantee you will learn at least a little something, if not a ton. So it's bit.ly /MLA score, all in capitals. You can do the Millbank Land Academy scorecard. I absolutely guarantee you will find some interesting stuff, and it will help you get much better deals. Let's say the existing use value, it's worth £2 million as it is.
Yeah.
I know that the landowner is not going to sell for less than £2 million. He's going to want an uplift. That uplift is going to be a negotiation.
Yep.
Maybe it's £2.5 million. I don't know. Who knows? You never know their exact circumstances. But they're not going to sell for less than it's worth. Basically, of course they're not. That's just common sense, right? Now, so I'm doing my numbers. I get a scheme created. I go away. I work out the optimum size, type, mix of uses and homes, the most efficient way to build them. I do all of my numbers, taking into account all of the various requirements. Affordable housing is going to be a big one. Section 106, SIL, BNG, etc., etc. Lots of costs, finance, everything that goes into a development appraisal, and the result of providing a fully compliant scheme, i.e., let's just say it's 35% affordable housing and all the other bits and pieces, right? If the result of having to provide all of those things means that my development appraisal shows that I am at or below the existing use value, therefore it isn't viable, but it could be made viable if maybe I don't provide typically quite as much affordable housing or something like that. How do I deal with that?
That's planning viability. The basis of planning viability is comparing the residual value from a development scheme to the benchmark land value of the site. And the benchmark land value is predominantly based on the existing use value with potentially a premium. There is no set premium, but it could be anything between 0 and, as guidance indicates, up to potentially 30%, although there are instances where it can be different to that. And you'll find an awful lot of schemes come forward with an assumption of a 20% premium over the existing use value. There is an alternative, which is the alternative use value to create the benchmark land value rather than the existing use. The alternative use value assumes potentially development on a site. So, for example, you've got a car park, it's got an old housing consent on it, which isn't particularly efficient, but it produces a higher land value than the existing car park use value. And providing you can demonstrate its deliverability, you can use the alternative use value as your basis of benchmark land value, but it doesn't attract a premium. The only exceptions to those are really in agricultural uses, where the premium associated with agricultural land tends to be a multiplier of the value of the land rather than a percentage premium over the existing use.
Is there a typical multiplier?
No. There are some conventions which are beginning to appear, but it very much depends on the quality of the land and its location and various other factors. But they can be up to 10, 15 times the land value.
Yeah. And I should say, just to cover your arse for you, that none of this is advice. I'm just really trying for people to understand how all of these things work, you know? So, and look, as is already becoming clear, right? It's all a very grey area, and there is no hard and fast really with most of these things.
That's true. I mean, I was going to say a negotiation. It's not in that form. I mean, the process has been set up under National Planning Policy Framework with advice set out in the planning practice guidance, as well as professional guidance. And it's been the source of quite a lot of case law in terms of planning appeals. So there's a lot out there to help plot one's way through this. But you need to look at the evidence carefully, you need to analyse it properly, you need to demonstrate your underlying principles. Ultimately, that's the best way of doing it, is do a good job in terms of how you're approaching it, a rigorous job.
So we've got our £2 million existing use value.
Yep.
We need to establish the benchmark land value. Let's just say we think, or we can argue that it's 20%. For
Yep.
You know, we've got to pick something for now. So it's 2.4 million.
Yep.
So that is the sort of the barrier, the bar, the hurdle, whatever you want to call it, that we're measuring against. Yeah. So we go away and do our development appraisal, a residual appraisal, and the result of doing that with a fully policy compliant scheme, giving the local authority everything they want, including, let's just say it's London 35% affordable housing, and I talk about affordable housing because that's usually the thing that has most likelihood to make things unviable or less viable, right?
Yeah.
We do our numbers on a fully policy compliant scheme, and the result of that is that the residual land value is only £2 million, so below the benchmark land value, which means it's not viable. If it's fully policy compliant, what do we do then?
Well, most policies allow the flex in the affordable housing elements. So if planning obligations, Section 106 obligations, relate to offsetting the impact of the development on the area within which the development's happening, those tend to be less flexible in one sense, certainly in terms of the way in which policy is worded. So most policies will look to ensure that the impact of development is mitigated, leaving the affordable housing element to be the flexible element in the layer cake of planning requirements. So in that circumstance, you would reduce the affordable housing content so that your residual land value is 2.4 million.
Yeah.
And at that point, you've got effectively a viable scheme. You couldn't then reduce it further to make sure that you produced a residual land value that was 2.6 million, for example, because that would imply you're making more than the land value.
Yeah, exactly. So what I'm trying to do here is get, some people that won't understand this might be like, why are you not building enough affordable housing? Why are you not providing 50% or whatever the requirement might be? People don't understand unless they're trying to, they understand this whole existing use benchmark land value thing, and they also understand the whole assessment process. They don't realise, well, the reason you often can't do that is just because it's not viable. You can't persuade landowners to sell. You can't get to the right number if the development itself has to pay for all the things it's asked to pay for.
It is extremely difficult for schemes coming forward to be 100% policy compliant.
I've ever had one in 40 years. And that's not because I've been trying to dodge it. It's just because they haven't worked financially. Just haven't stacked up. Quite often it might be, we want everything to be bungalows. Well, lovely, but you don't usually get sites to stack up very well if it's all bungalows.
There's an overarching requirement. The planning policy is not there to stop delivery of homes. There is a general public benefit in delivering new homes. The issue is inevitably the impact and managing the impact of the delivery of those new homes in that particular location. And when the layering of additional objectives comes to play, you're finding that viability, which all has to be covered effectively by the gross development value of the scheme, less its build costs, less its the costs that are absolutely required to deliver
Fees,
finance and other things. If there isn't enough money, out of that, what I call gross profit, for want of a better description, if there isn't enough gross profit in it to pay for all of those requirements, then one has to, the policy, if it's sensible, will allow flex. Where that policy is implemented without flexibility, then it effectively starts preventing development. But government has, successive governments for a long time require local authorities. There's a brief period when in the previous government they took off this requirement, but when they are not delivering to their 5-year housing supply, when they're under-delivering in that location, and they're using policy to effectively push forward a NIMBY type agenda, then there is a weighted balance that tilts in favour of development in that location. It then makes it very difficult for the local authority to refuse schemes. So there is at a higher level, at a government level, a mechanism to try and overcome local authorities who use policy to block development. But it's a slow process. You'll usually have to go to an appeal.
Yeah.
And that creates cost and time implications.
For everyone, obviously, for the developer, for the local authority, and of course, all the time this is happening, you're not getting any housing.
That's exactly right.
At all. Not only are you not getting 35 or 50% housing, you're not getting any housing, full stop.
I'll put a shout out here for the planning officers, because the officers do understand these fundamentals in terms of the way in which policy actually works. They're professionals in what they do, and the number of planning reports that I've seen going to planning committees which say, we have tested all of this through the policy requirements, and we are advising you as officers that this is a consentable scheme, and is then refused and is then taken to appeal, which inevitably, because the professionals who have vetted the scheme prior to going to the committee have already said it should be granted, the council loses the appeal and then gets hit with costs as a result of that, means that not only are you not getting the housing, but the actual costs to the council are increasing substantially for every appeal that they lose. So whilst the politicians who sit in the committees may be in a position to be able to say, well, I've done what my constituents have, which my constituents have requested of me, and I've blocked that development from happening, ultimately they're also putting up the council tax bill.
And it's worth adding, I mean, obviously, if and when a reduced affordable housing, quota is agreed, that doesn't happen lightly. You have to justify what you're doing. It's sort of an open book in terms of, your values, your costs, but your development appraisal, but you need to robustly justify it.
Yeah.
It's tested by independent experts on behalf of the council. If the planning officer, if you got to the point of getting a recommendation for approval on any scheme, really, it's because you would have done a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
With, hopefully, in conjunction and collaboration.
I mean, I think, part of the problem is that the weight of evidence and information that need to be provided for schemes in excess of 10 units have been incredibly burdensome. Now we're looking at a new proposition of a medium size, so that small, medium, or minor, medium, and large or major development, creating a new class of development with less onerous obligations in terms of provision of information than the major schemes, freeing up some of the decision-making capacity of local authorities by giving discretion to officers to grant consents for everything, for all the householder stuff, and taking it out of the committee's need to impact on those decisions. So hopefully there is something good coming down the line for those small, medium-sized developers delivering schemes of between sort of 10 and 50 units.
Big thing I'm trying to do is help more SME developers get back in the game and survive. Affordable housing policy, actually, I think has been one of the biggest blockers, because there's so many developers. Typically in lots of places, London, the trigger level on affordable housing is 10 units, 10 or more. Tends to be a requirement. Lots of smaller developers, they just stay under the 10 because getting involved in that is it just makes everything even more complicated and expensive. In terms of having to have these arguments and backwards and forwards and justify it and get it agreed, and very often you don't get it agreed and then you have to go to appeal. It's just massively painful that developers get forced to stay small in order to avoid it. The other thing, just to make sure let people know, is that let's just say you've got a 15 home scheme, and there's a 33% affordable housing requirement. So 5 of those homes have to be given away. And very often they are close to being given away. What you actually get for them doesn't cover too much more than the development costs nowadays, which makes things, again, is one of the other things that's made things increasingly unviable. You have to give 5 of them away, let's just say. But the problem is, housing associations don't actually want little schemes of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 affordable homes, because it's hard to manage, and they're tied up busy sorting out their existing stock and all the rest of it. Now, this is not going to go down probably that well, because it sounds like a really bad thing, trying not to provide affordable housing. Raising the trigger level to 20 or 25, honestly, that would create a lot more housing a lot quicker. What do you think of that?
I think you're right. I think the moment you put in any sort of barrier, any weir across the development flow, you're going to create a point where people try and avoid it. So putting a 10-unit limit on means that people will deliver 9. We're seeing this now with the Building Safety Act, where if you're delivering less than 6 stories or 80 metres, then you're not beholden to the full gateway 1, 2, 3, 4 process for fire safety. So major, or what I call significant developers, larger developers in the UK, are now delivering schemes of less than 6 stories to avoid the time impact of going through the gateway processes. So we're going to see, architecturally, an impact in the UK of smaller schemes coming forward, underutilising potential development sites in urban centres because people are just not prepared to put their finances at that risk. And what should be a 13-week process is taking up to 42, 50 weeks. People can't hold development on the basis of having that sort of a impact on their development pipeline. Time is little, or the impact of time isn't reflected in the planning process properly. If a location is consistently taking a long time to deliver planning applications, it will attract less investment because people cannot turn their capital around. They cannot get the benefit of their investment in capital quickly enough to make the use of that capital in that location work. I haven't got the stats on the average time it takes to get a planning consent these days, but there are some out there, and I suspect that the time of takes to get a planning application now has gone out massively from
look,
what it was.
It's slow. Very, very slow. Everyone knows that. Local authorities are massively under-resourced. We know that. That's one of the major problems. So for them, it's just stress, pressure, lots of planning applications to deal with. And they're getting through them. Hopefully, most of them as fast as they can. But they really don't understand the impact on developers that have got, legal agreements running out. If you don't get planning permission by a certain point in time, but basically your contract will die. And that's the end of the deal. I mean, that happens. Maybe you've got planning permission, but you still need to get a resolution to grant. You've got to get a Section 106 signed or planning condition signed off. So you might have bought the site or you owned it already, and it's costing you a fortune in interest. I mean, I don't think planners just don't understand the implications of all of this. And of course, all of those additional costs that get lumped onto development means there is less to pay for affordable housing and all of the other things that are really needed.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the process has become so complicated for the delivery of development. It is taking away investment in the proposal, in the delivery of new homes. And this is, the stats are clear. I mean, the last time we reached sort of in excess of 300,000 homes in a year was in the 70s. And that's the sort of level of development we're going to have to deliver. And in those days, 45% of homes were being delivered by local authorities, essentially.
Viability assessments.
Yeah.
A couple of the sort of key variables that end up being a bit of an argument are the benchmark land value. Yep. So, what percentage over and above existing use value is reasonable for a landowner that they should have to accept? At the end of the day, there is no should. They're going to just accept what they want to accept, unless, of course, you get into compulsory purchase. We've just discussed all that. I don't want to go there again. We've established that it's complicated, and unless it's a massive monster scheme, it's probably not going to happen, right? So landowners aren't going to sell unless they think it's reasonable and they want to sell. So what that existing that benchmark land value percentage uplift is often a debate. The other one that's often a big debate is what is a reasonable developer's profit margin.
There is no set number in theory. There is a lot of convention. One of the aspects of the planning policy wording is it can, the other FVAs, other financial viability assessments for planning are part of the evidence base. So there are conventions that have come forward, but those conventions tend to lag a reality. And that can be good when the market's going up. It can be bad when the market's going down. So if an acceptable level of profit in a rising market, in other words, if where profit is a measure effectively of developer risk, it's a return on risk, then developers might be prepared to take a tighter margin because they've got more certainty on it. Where you've got a flat or falling market, the developer will need to have a return which is reflective of that risk in that market. And if all of the local authorities have been working off the previous positive market, they won't accept a higher level of return that's required in a falling market. And it becomes a discussion point, as you say. there is a conception that developers make a load of profit. The reality is demonstrably different. In the market that we're in, small and medium-sized developers, in 88, 49%, 47% of housing was delivered by SME developers. 2022, 10% of the 193,000 homes delivered were by SME developers. The number of SME developers have been squeezed out of the market. The number of units being delivered is reducing. At the same time, in parallel, we've seen an increase in the complexity and effectively cost of planning. And I think the two are hugely interrelated.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I wanted to get onto the final sort of bit about developers' profit margins, is because I don't know to what extent planners and people in local authorities actually understand the implications of this whole thing that we're talking about here regarding developers' margins.
I think one of the issues is the word profit. So when it's described as developers' profit, there's a misunderstanding as to what that profit number means. So in simple terms, the cost of delivering a scheme relates to the costs associated with building that particular scheme. But if you're a developer of any reasonable size, you've got an office, you've got overheads, you've got an infrastructure which supports the delivery of those schemes. And all of that comes out of that developer's margin, that gross developer's margin from a development scheme. So it's not pure profit. And because it's been presented as developer's profit, they think that's how much money is being put in the pockets of the people who are running the development business. It's not true. Where you're a major business and you're employing dozens and dozens of people as part of your overall development business, if you haven't got enough money to pay for those head office costs, then you're taking away the infrastructure of developers to deliver future housing numbers. It's a misunderstood area at the local authority level. The smaller developers will tend to be paying higher margins for their materials, for their labour. They won't have the infrastructure. They'll have to buy those services in, usually proportionately. They'll be more expensive than those delivered by a larger developer in-house. Their cost of money will be greater. The cost of money and financing is a hugely flexible area in reality, and the way in which it's funded or development is funded, we could have an entire conversation about how finance is understood within a developer context. But the larger house builders have got access to balance sheet funding in a way that small developers don't, where it's project funding, and therefore the marginal costs for the smaller developer are greater. Therefore, they should and need a higher return to cover those risks inherent in being a small developer. Again, this points to why we've had such a reduction in the number of small developers or medium houses being built by small, medium-sized enterprises recently.
Yeah, well, not just recently. I mean, over the last 40-odd years, really, and it's getting worse in terms of the demise of them.
Yes.
As things get squeezed more and more. So that's why I wanted to talk about the whole profit margins thing, because just like increasing the trigger level on affordable housing, I think would create a lot more homes. In an ideal world, when it comes to viability assessments, perhaps having a higher acceptable margin for smaller developers would also give them more buffer or security in terms of making it less likely that things are going to go wrong and the schemes can be made more viable.
Well, I mean, either you need to be more. There needs to be a more realistic process in assessing viability for planning purposes, which means, I mean, at the moment, the way the policy is interpreted in the PPG is that you use standard inputs. Now, that's not really a very well worded piece of of advice, because to some people, standard inputs means, well, we've always applied 6% for financing costs, and therefore we'll carry on applying 6% in the face of that being an unsustainably low number in the current market. There needs to be some clarification, or it would be helpful for clarification to help inform officers and members as to what that actually means. But it's also complex. I mean, development funding is complex. There'll be a certain amount of equity that's being put in by the developer. There'll be some senior money, senior debt coming in, which will be relatively risk averse and therefore won't necessarily give them all the money they need. They may have to put in some mezzanine finance, some additional higher cost of money to bridge the gap between the equity they've got available and the senior debt. And that money might be very expensive. So in aggregate, and that's without even talking about the opportunity cost of capital that the developer's putting in there, which is sort of merged into the developer's return, the structure of financing of development isn't very well articulated in the policy process, but it's a very real cost in the actual delivery of development. And often that money might be time limited and require things to happen in certain timeframes which are not achievable in planning terms, as you alluded to earlier on. You know, the money is there today, it might not be there tomorrow.
So again, it's complicated, isn't it?
Life is complicated.
Well, life is complicated. I mean, life as a developer seems to be even more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, there are ways to cut through the complications. Whilst there are, how do I put it? You can engage with some local authorities better than others. You can have honest conversations prior to putting in your planning application, which means that you can get a direction of travel. But officers who have been putting in reports which have been recommending approval and being turned down at committee, and then they're having to defend a decision made at committee in appeal and then losing those appeals, it's a tough place to go to get that sort of clarity as part of the early planning process as to how you should approach it. So you've got to be prepared as a developer to engage in order to save time. I mean, ultimately, it's in order to save time. When you're going through a PPA process where you're signing up with a performance agreement with the local authority in terms of the decision-making process attached to your planning application, that should be a two-way street. There should be a quid pro quo in terms of giving an extended period on decision-making, but it's, I don't think, often perceived in that sense. So there are things one can do to manage the process, manage the risk. There are approaches that you can use to reduce the risk of both delivery and in terms of maintaining and protecting the return that you need to get to be a developer. I mean, ultimately, if you can't make schemes deliverable, if you don't make money out of development, you're not really a developer. You're ceasing to do the very thing that is at the heart of your business.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, what obviously happens is people cease to be developers because, deals go wrong, they go bust, and then the decline of SME developers continues, and then you get even less housing. And all the people, complaining about, it's only the big house builders, and well, stop battering the little ones then.
Yeah, I mean, it's, as you say, there needs to be, and there is gradually a recognition, understanding, I think, in government, that if the small and medium-sized house builders aren't supported, that we will lose a huge amount of capacity from the market, as we already have. We'll lose even more. I mean, these are quite apart from the other problems that are coming down the track in terms of things like the lack of skilled labour, which is going to make pricing more, even higher, which is pushing at one level to efficiency of builds, modern methods of construction and panelised systems and similar. But those will be difficult for small, medium-sized enterprises to access, because they suit larger volume delivery propositions.
So, as we have said many times, it is difficult, but hopefully more people understand this stuff, the more they'll start being a bit nicer to us. A couple of final questions. If you could change one thing, or come up with a bit of policy to make things much easier for SME developers. It needs to be made easier for everyone, but I'm particularly keen on sorting out SME developers. What would that be?
There's a long list. But certainly a greater understanding at local authority and local authority councillor level of how the planning system should work, not how they would like it to work, but how it should work. Give the appropriate protection to officers making recommendations so that they have got discretion to make some of the smaller schemes come forward at greater speed without feeling that they're not going to have their backs covered in committee. I think that's a real problem for officers at the moment. I think that the statutory consultation process has now become enormously complex and burdensome. When you're building 100 miles inland or 70 miles inland and you're having to deal with impacts of coastal, sites, and we could talk endlessly about not only biodiversity net gain but nutrient neutrality and all that flows from it. When you're placing those sorts of almost existential burdens on a development and a location, you make it extremely difficult to make it make money. It's the continuous layering of what at an individual level looks straightforward, but in aggregate makes it very, very difficult to deliver. I think it was Angela Rayner who said recently, houses not badges, or something similar. There has got to be a management of the expectations of what development can support, and at the moment the burden is against developers in that context.
Interesting. I like badgers.
I love badgers. I love newts. I love our wonderful coast, and I love our rivers that you should be able to swim in.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's got to be a proper recognition about where all of these burdens and costs can land. And if they're all landing at the developer's door, then you're putting all of society's problems on one doorstep.
I think that's a really good way to summarise that, actually. I mean, that has happened. So, and again, all of it does is squeeze us even more, makes more and more things unviable. Ultimate result is you get less developers and less houses, right? Town centre regeneration.
Yeah,
I know I'm jumping about there, but I know you like that. What would be a one big thing that could help with that?
I think the speed at which planning policy can be created would make a big difference. At the moment, it takes a long time to create a new plan. Now, that's in part because it's got to last for a significant period of time, and therefore it's got to be rigorously tested to determine whether or not it's the answer. But getting town centre regeneration underway in the UK needs a huge commitment from a local authority to be clear about what it is they're trying to do to create an environment within which people can invest and see a return within a time frame that's meaningful. If you're a major landowner with a depreciated asset and you're not going to be able to make the sort of significant changes that be required because you've got to wait for a 3 to 5 year process to enable you to produce something which is deliverable, it's too far over the horizon to see a realizable return profile. You've got to have a very long-term vision to see over that horizon beyond most commercial entities' immediate capacity. I mean, that's not, some of the larger long-term hold investors in living sectors will want to be able to hold assets for 20, 30, maybe even 40 years. If you don't know when you can see a return, because you don't know whether that major scheme can be brought forward because the policy isn't in place or it's not going to be supportive, and it's going to be a 3 to 5 year battle to get the consent, you go, well, I'll go and invest it in America or somewhere else.
Yeah.
I mean, money is incredibly flexible. It goes wherever it's going to get a return. It doesn't need to go anywhere in England. It can go anywhere. And the more complicated we make processes, and that's not to say we shouldn't have processes, but the more complex the process, the more difficult it is to see a definable return horizon, the less money we will find attracted to the UK. And the UK is a very attractive location because of its certainty. Once you've got it in, it works, but it's difficult. And we're seeing investment not arriving in the UK as a consequence of the planning processes that we have in place. And that's not helpful.
Okay, so let's try to finish on a little bit of a high note. So just, I actually think this government actually is doing a good job, actually, in terms of they made a lot of changes to planning, really quickly, actually.
Yeah.
I think they're having a good go. So sort of credit where credit is due. Fair play to them so far, but there is still lots to do and lots to be particularly understood. Developers, really, the people and funders, I suppose, the people that are putting their cash and their whatsits and very often their houses on the line, to get stuff created need a lot more certainty. Yeah,
I mean, nobody's going to invest in something that they can't see a return on. I think this government has had to get to grips with a number of things. Whether it's defence spending, whether it's recognition that the housing market isn't producing what it needs to produce, and are looking to change things, but they've got to do it quickly. Look, I think adversity there's opportunities in every area, every adversity. You just have to be really clear thinking about how you're going to make them work.
Every challenge creates opportunity.
It does.
All right. Okay, mate. Thanks for coming. Thanks for tuning in to Inside Property Development. Please remember to like and subscribe. Do join us every week where we'll be speaking to house builders, developers, experts, planners, and everyone involved in trying to get more much needed housing created the right way. We'll learn together how we can collaborate rather than fight, and by working together, we can all help create better places, spaces and homes and a much more beautiful world.